On this channel, we've covered various aspects of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and several of its kings. However, we've never really gone over the earliest kings of the Achaemenid line, and that's what we're going to cover in this program. Our main source for the lineage of Cyrus the Great and the early Achaemenid kings comes from Cyrus himself, in the form of a small clay cylinder that was discovered amongst the ruins of Babylon. The popular name for this object is the Cyrus cylinder. On it, Cyrus the Great claims the following: I am Cyrus, king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters of the world, son of Cambyses, the great king, king of the city of Anshan, grandson of Cyrus, the great king, king of the city of Anshan, descendant of Thespis, the great king, king of the city of Anshan. So, before Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great, there were three kings: his father, Cambyses the First, his grandfather, Cyrus the First, and his great-grandfather, Thespis. They were all rulers of a kingdom known as Anshan. So, what do we know about these kings of Anshan? Unfortunately, not much. However, you might be familiar with the name Anshan from past episodes on Elam, and if so, well, you have an excellent memory. Anshan, along with the city of Susa, was one of the great power centers of the land in antiquity known as Elam. For millennia, the Elamites were considered to have been the main antagonists of the various kingdoms and empires of ancient Mesopotamia. The two lands had a long history together, and the Elamite kings who took the title, King of Anshan and Susa, were both respected and feared throughout the Near East. However, by the 7th century BC, Elam was a mere shadow of its former self. Wars with Assyria and dynastic squabbles had weakened it politically beyond repair. This doesn't mean that it was insignificant. On the contrary, Elamite kings still meddled in the affairs of Mesopotamia, but they didn't command as much power or influence as they once had nearly 1,000 years prior. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BC, references to Anshan in both Assyrian and Elamite texts from Susa are practically absent, with the exception of a few mentions in passing, as well as various Elamite rulers at times still using the title King of Anshan and Susa. This, though, was more of a ceremonial title. Many kings of ancient Mesopotamia also took the title King of Sumer and Akkad, despite the fact that they often ruled little territory belonging to either. Both the Assyrians and the Elamite government in Susa kept records and correspondence with all of their neighbors. The fact that in both of these, there's scarcely a mention of Anshan speaks pretty clearly. Anshan was a place of little importance, both economically and strategically. How or why Anshan virtually disappeared from written texts is unknown. Perhaps there was a great war in which most of the people were killed. Perhaps it was due to a drought or mass starvation. Maybe it was even a plague brought by trading caravans from the east. Or maybe its people simply wished to move on to greener pastures elsewhere. We know little except for the fact that, at least according to the archaeological record, the population of Anshan had shrunk considerably over the centuries. This perhaps made it possible for the migration into the region of a bunch of Indo-European tribes who may have settled around the once great Elamite city. The most prominent of these were a people that we today know as the Persians, and it was likely their leader, a man whose name in Old Persian is Chishpish, who founded a new dynasty there. He's better known to us by the Greek version of his name, Thespis. Ruling probably from the 7th century BC onward, Thespis became the king of what was then the small state of Anshan, today in the province of Fars, Iran. We still don't know exactly what transpired in Anshan, only that these Persians were now in control of it and the surrounding areas. It's likely that due to the poverty found in Anshan, the land that would eventually become the heartland of the early Persian kingdom, that Elamite kings in Susa may have paid little attention to it. Their focus was primarily on the great Assyrian threat to the west, and they consistently intervened on behalf of really any faction that opposed Assyrian rule in neighboring Babylonia. While ultimately the Assyrians were able to smash all Babylonian resistance, it often came at a huge cost, both in men, money, and prestige. In 648 BC, the armies of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal entered Babylon one last time to end a civil war that had been led by the king's own brother, who also happened to be supported by Elam. After decades of Elamite meddling in Assyrian affairs, Ashurbanipal had had enough of the Elamite nuisance. In 647 BC, he entered Elam, and for the next few years, his armies ravaged the country without mercy, including the great city of Susa, which, if Assyrian accounts are to be believed, was burned and then completely razed to the ground. By 645 BC, Elam, at least as a political entity, was no more. It had been devastated beyond repair. Interestingly enough, Ashurbanipal's sack of Elam and Susa coincided with the reign of Thespis, which most scholars place between the years 650 to 620 BC. With the fall of Susa and Elamite power in general, Thespis was now free to officially take over Anshan and other nearby lands to found his own kingdom. And thus, the Kingdom of Persia was born. Other than this, little else is known about Thespis, his life, or the geographical extent of his new Persian kingdom, save for the fact that he seems to have had at least 2 sons. One would succeed him to become Cyrus the First of Persia, the grandfather of Cyrus the Great. The other son's name, who we really only know about through the inscriptions of Darius the Great, was Ariaramnes, from whom Darius's line of the Achaemenids claims descent. As with Thespis, there is very little information about Cyrus the First, whose name in Old Persian is Kurush. Based on a text found within the ruins of the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, some scholars believe that perhaps in the aftermath of Susa's destruction, there may have been some contact between the early Persian kingdom and the Assyrian Empire. The text being referenced describes a delegation sent sometime during the 640s BC to the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. It states, "Cyrus, the king of Parsumash, heard about my victory. He became aware of the might that I wielded with the aid of Ashur, Bel, and Nabu, the great gods my lords, with which I leveled the whole of Elam like a flood. He sent Aruku, his eldest son, with his tribute to Nineveh, the city of my lordship, to pay homage to me. He implored my lordship." Now, what's really happening here is that the son of this king, Cyrus of Parsumash, Aruku, though being called a guest, is really a glorified hostage at the Assyrian court. There were a couple of reasons as to why the Assyrian king would make such an arrangement. One was to ensure the loyalty of a kingdom such as Parsumash, as well as to prevent hostilities by keeping a prince at the Assyrian court as a sort of human shield. The other was that eventually, the prince would be sent back to his respective land, in this case, Parsumash, as an ally to rule on Assyria's behalf. For Assyria, it was basically a little insurance and one way to possibly avoid conflicts with its subjects, or perhaps neighbors with whom a treaty had been signed. Scholars, though, are not in agreement as to whether or not Parsumash was the same kingdom as the Persian kingdom of Anshan. The only other real piece of evidence of Cyrus the First's existence is a seal impression of a rider slaying his enemies with an inscription that reads, "Cyrus the Anshanite, son of Thespis." This seal is imprinted on several of the fortification tablets found at Persepolis, which was built about a century after Cyrus the First lived. And so, many believe that the original seal may have been a sort of heirloom that was passed on to future kings and used for auspicious or inaugural documents. Cyrus the First's son was Cambyses the First, whose name in Old Persian is Kambugia. We know a bit more about him, mostly due to Greek sources. Reigning between 590 to 559 BC, Cambyses' reign seems to have been rather stable and uneventful. He was married to a woman named Mandani, the daughter of King Astyages of Media. According to Herodotus, this man, he discovered, was from a good family, had a peaceful disposition, and Astyages considered him much lower in status than even a middle-class Mede. It can be inferred from this line that the Persians were likely vassals of the Medes, and so not equal to them in rank. In 559 BC, Cambyses I was succeeded by his son, Cyrus II, who as we know would go on to found the greatest empire of his day. The rest, as we say, is history, which you can check out in episodes on Cyrus the Great and the other kings of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. So, if you didn't before, I hope that you now have a much better idea about the history of the early Achaemenid kingdom. As always, thanks so much for stopping by, I really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Grankek69, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Toby S. Winder, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Cy on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and listen to special audio programs, like this one, on the History with Cy podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.